Hi, this is Megan Thompson, and this is a sample lesson of what I do when I work with my AP U.S. Government and Politics students. The course has 15 required cases that are covered on the AP exam, and so we intentionally focus our understanding of the Constitution around those cases. And so today we're looking at the First Amendment at school specifically, and there are 3 cases in the required curriculum for AP Government that have to do with cases at school. The first is Wisconsin versus Yoder, which is about Amish students who would like to opt out of school after the 8th grade and determining whether forcing students to attend beyond that point is a violation of the free exercise clause of the freedom of religion. Engel versus Vitale, which looks at the establishment clause of the freedom of religion part of the First Amendment in evaluating whether or not schools can have mandatory prayers for students. And then finally, Tinker versus Des Moines, probably the most famous of the school-related cases, led by 2 siblings who wore black armbands in protest of the Vietnam War and were suspended from school. And the court famously determined that students' rights do not stop at the schoolhouse gate as a result of that case. I start off this lesson, I always do it on a Wednesday because Wednesday is the day that our students say the pledge in their advisory classes, which is like a homeroom. And for a long time, we didn't do the pledge. For the first 4 months of the year, we didn't do it. And I think someone went to our admin, I don't know if it was a parent or if it was a teacher, and mentioned that it's actually part of Minnesota state law that we do this. And so we need to get back in the habit of it. And so then the pledge spontaneously began occurring during their advisory time, since students were a little confused as to why all of a sudden this had come back. And so this helps to prompt that lesson and get students thinking about these mandatory activities in school. And we talk about how it's mandatory for the school to do it, but not necessarily mandatory for the students to participate. So this slide shows the Pledge of Allegiance and how it's morphed over time. So the 1892 Bellamy Salute was the portion of the pledge without the colorful highlights. So I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And actually, originally, during the part where they would say to the flag, they would salute by stretching their arm out towards the flag. And they actually changed that during World War II because it looked a little bit too much like the Nazi salute. And so now it's just a traditional right hand over your heart, and that's outlined in flag code section 4. In 1923 is when they added of the United States of America. In 54, during the Red Scare, is when they added under God. Bellamy was not happy with that addition, but that's something that Eisenhower did as a part of really combating the fear of communism. And then ultimately, the Minnesota statute is how it applies to our student. And this slide shows specifically what the Minnesota statute requires, that either the classroom teacher or a surrogate or over the school intercom plays the Pledge of Allegiance or recites the Pledge of Allegiance. It does clarify that students and teachers are allowed to decline to participate if they would like, and the students will be looking at a court case that establish their right to be able to do that. And then at the top, it shows a map of the states that have laws in place that require schools to have the Pledge of Allegiance as part of their school day. Those are the states that are in blue, obviously including Minnesota. The states where it's optional for schools to do so is identified by the red states, and then the yellow states are the ones where there's no law on the books for the Pledge of Allegiance. Moving into religion in schools, and not even necessarily religion, but this idea of pledging allegiance to something is at the core of a case that does involve students who refuse to participate for religious reasons. But obviously this ties in very much right now with what we see with players who are choosing to kneel during the national anthem. And we talk a little bit about how that could be different in a public versus a private school. A private school could force students to stand and participate if they would like, whereas at a public school, you would certainly have much more protected rights in that environment. And so we talk about how religion, or at least philosophy, ties in with what a school can mandate for students to do, which would be walking that line of establishing religion versus the free exercise clause of making sure that religion or students with strong religious beliefs have the opportunity to practice their religion as well. Our student has a very large Somali population, so we have many students who have to leave the classroom at particular times of day to participate in the call to prayer, and that's just part of the daily life in our building. So for our students, it's a little bit more understandable than perhaps in a rural area where there's not a lot of religious diversity. And so we take a look at prayer in school through one case. We relate that then to the pledge. We talk about holidays in school. Holiday lights in December are always a dramatic thing that happens in our school. And so we've gone to the white lights to try and be as neutral as possible. And so that's part of the reason why I like to show them the White House Christmas decorations, because our school makes very sure to be non-religious. And then we take a look at Democrats and Republicans and the enormous amount of overtly Christmas decorations that they have both in and around the White House. So I changed this picture according to whichever president happens to be in office. And then I've got video clips that students have the option of watching of former presidents, especially the Bush family when they started with their little Scotty dogs running around the White House with the videos, and then the Obamas continued that with their dog Bo, and the history of acquiring the White House Christmas tree itself as well. This year it's from Minnesota, so that's kind of exciting for students. So it's great to talk about the drama that we have in our building about it sometimes, and then also connect it to how that compares to what federal offices might have. And all of that kind of lays the groundwork for students starting to think about the role of religion and being able to practice it themselves and having it endorsed in some way by the school, which relates to our three major cases that we're looking at. And whenever students see that icon with the judge and the gavel next to them, they know that that means it's a required case. It's one that could pop up on the AP exam. So this slide shows an image that I hope is iconic enough that it will stick in students' minds and help them remember. So I know that for very visual students, seeing Wisconsin versus Yoder and then seeing an Amish family walking up the steps of the Supreme Court, that's going to be enough to trigger their memory as to what this case is about. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see a screenshot of the Google Doc that students will be completing. We have a program where you can automatically assign individuals a Google Drive assignment, and that makes a copy for them, and they're able to submit to the teacher in that way. And so this walks them through some pre-reading questions to talk about the First Amendment, clarify the free exercise clause and the establishment clause, and then they already have background knowledge about Wisconsin versus Yoder because it's a required case. And so the information that is required towards the center of the screen is about the West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett case, which is the Pledge of Allegiance case. So the AP exam requires students to learn about a related case, in this case the Barnett case, and then relate it to a required case. So it does not provide them with any information about Wisconsin versus Yoder. They have to have that background knowledge already, but it will provide them information about a related case. And so they would complete this on their own first, and then we talk about it as a class, clarify the different answers that could possibly be accepted by the College Board. So this first case addresses the free exercise clause because it is about an Amish family that believes that their freedom of religion is being violated by being forced to continue to attend school after 8th grade. And then in the Barnett case, they feel that they're not allowed to freely practice their religion if they're punished for sitting during the Pledge of Allegiance. And so both of those cases look at free exercise. The next case, Engel versus Vitale, looks at the establishment clause instead. So specifically prayer in schools, if students are required to participate in a prayer, and the school's sanction of religious practices. So Engel versus Vitale is the case that they know already, and again, hopefully a image that will help them to remember that, a visual that will help to stick that in their mind. And then they're relating it to the famous case Lemon versus Kurtzman, which surprisingly isn't required by the College Board. However, the Lemon test, which is a result of Lemon versus Kurtzman, is part of their curriculum. So this is an important case for students to understand. The Lemon test basically is a way to evaluate whether or not a school is endorsing religion with the way that it spends money. If a district is providing money or a state is providing money for busing for students to religious schools, if it's providing money for funding for students with disabilities in religious schools, that would pass the Lemon test. That would be fine. Whereas if they are requiring a prayer in school, then that would clearly be problematic and not pass the entanglement clause of the Lemon test. So this again asks them A, B, and C question, or prompt A is always to identify the constitutional clause that's common to the case excerpted as well as their required case. Part B asks them how the cases relate to one another, either one serving as a precedent or how the facts of the cases led to different ideas. And then part C, that third part, always asks them to connect it to some bigger political process. The final case that they look at moves a little bit away from the religious idea and into the broader idea of free speech in the First Amendment. And so it compares the case of Mary Beth Tinker and her brother wearing these black armbands that you can see pictured to Matthew Frazier in Bethel versus Frazier. And Matthew Frazier gives a speech to his entire high school, and in it has some sexual innuendo about the candidate that he's endorsing and is ultimately suspended. And whereas the court protects the right to political speech in Tinker, it does not protect Matthew Frazier's right because it determines that he is not making a political statement by doing this. It's intentionally inflammatory and it's inappropriate in school, especially as teachers are acting in loco parentis. And so it helps to clarify when things are acceptable and where things cross the line. And also prompts a really good discussion about whether or not this case would even remotely raise eyebrows today. Matthew Frazier talks about how the candidate is firm in his beliefs, he's firm in his pants. That's where the sexual innuendo comes in. And I'm not sure that in schools today that would result in a suspension. And so we talk about how the court would have to consider the changing culture of the times from the 1986 case to something that might pop up in 2019. This leads us into the next bigger issue that we'll look at, which will no longer really address school-related cases, but will look at the First Amendment overall. So this shows you all of the limitations to the First Amendment and the cases that relate to it. So the Establishment Clause and Engel versus Vitale, free exercise, and Yoder. And clear and present danger is a case that doesn't have to do with school, and so we will actually look at that after this lesson is over with U.S. versus Schenck and starts to look at when speech can be limited. And the picture that you see over on the left-hand side is certainly an inflammatory picture, and the reason why I use it is because it's actually outside one of the high schools within our district. A couple years ago, the Westboro Baptist Church staged a protest outside the high school. It's very close to a medical center that's essentially on the other side of the street, and so they staged a protest, and it prompted a really good discussion about hate speech and where we draw those lines as to what should and should not be protected. So that is an intentionally in your face kind of picture to spark a good conversation. So that's an example of a lesson that helps to take a look at both primary and secondary sources. Primary sources with those visuals and secondary sources with the excerpts, which are all from oye.org, that does a really nice job of summarizing Supreme Court cases in a way that students can clearly understand.